with a picture taken by Falk in Sydney a month before. "You sent us the first 5, the rest were bought." This was paradise. We ran late and talked. Subject, the Mark Twain Club of Corrigan Castle, Ireland. My first knowledge of that club dates away back, all of 20 years, I should say. It came to me in the form of a courteous letter written on the note paper which I have described, and signed, "By order of the President, C. Pembroke, Secretary." It conveyed the fact that the club had been created in my honor, and added the hope that this token of appreciation of my work would meet with my approval. I answered with thanks, and did what I could to keep my gratification from overexposure. It was then that the long correspondence began. A letter came back, by order of the President, furnishing me the names of the members, 32 in number. With it came a copy of the Constitution and Bylaws, in pamphlet form, and artistically printed. The initiation fee and dues were in their proper place, also schedule of meetings, monthly, for essays upon works of mine, followed by discussions; quarterly, for business and a supper, without essays, but with after-supper speeches. Also there was a list of the officers, President, Vice President, Secretary, Treasurer, etc. The letter was brief, but it was pleasant reading, for it told me about the strong interest which the membership took in their new venture, etc., etc. It also asked me for a photograph, a special one. I went down and sat for it and sent it, with a letter, of course. Presently came the badge of the club, and very dainty and pretty it was, and very artistic. It was a frog peeping out from a graceful tangle of grass sprays and rushes, and was done in enamels on a gold basis, and had a gold pin back of it. After I had petted it, and played with it, and caressed it, and enjoyed it a couple of hours, the light happened to fall upon it at a new angle and revealed to me a cunning new detail. With the light just right, certain delicate shadings of the grass blades and rush stems wove themselves into a monogram, mine. You can see that that jewel was a work of art. And when you come to consider the intrinsic value of it, you must concede that it is not every literary club that could afford a badge like that. It was easily worth $75, in the opinion of Messrs. Marcus and Ward of New York. They said they could not duplicate it for that and make a profit. By this time the club was well under way, and from that time forth its secretary kept my off hours well supplied with business. He reported the club's discussions of my books with laborious fullness, and did his work with great spirit and ability. As a rule, he synopsized, but when a speech was especially brilliant he shorthanded it and gave me the best passages from it written out. There were 5 speakers whom he particularly favored in that way: Palmer, Forbes, Naylor, Norris, and Calder. Palmer and Forbes could never get through a speech without attacking each other, and each in his own way was formidably effective: Palmer in virile and eloquent abuse, Forbes in courtly and elegant but scalding satire. I could always tell which of them was talking without looking for his name. Naylor had a polished style and a happy knack at felicitous metaphor. Norris's style was wholly without ornament, but enviably compact, lucid, and strong. But, after all, Calder was the gem. He never spoke when sober, he spoke continuously when he wasn't. And certainly they were the drunkest speeches that a man ever uttered. They were full of good things, but so incredibly mixed up and wandering that it made one's head swim to follow him. They were not intended to be funny, but they were. Funny for the very gravity which the speaker put into his flowing miracles of incongruity. In the course of 5 years I came to know the styles of the 5 orators as well as I knew the style of any speaker in my own club at home. These reports came every month. They were written on foolscap, 600 words to the page, and usually about 25 pages in a report, a good 15,000 words, I should say, a solid week's work. The reports were absorbingly entertaining, long as they were. But unfortunately for me they did not come alone. They were always accompanied by a lot of questions about passages and purposes in my books, which the club wanted answered, and additionally accompanied every quarter by the treasurer's report, and the auditor's report, and the committee's report, and the president's review, and my opinion of these was always desired. Also suggestions for the good of the club, if any occurred to me. By and by I came to dread those things, and this dread grew and grew and grew until I got to anticipating them with a cold horror. For I was an indolent man, and not fond of letter-writing, and whenever these things came I had to put everything by and sit down, for my own peace of mind, and dig until I got something out of my head which would answer for a reply. I got along fairly well the first year, but for the succeeding 4 years the Mark Twain Club of Corrigan Castle was my curse, my nightmare, the grief and misery of my life, and I got so sick of sitting for photographs. I sat every year for 5 years, trying to satisfy that insatiable organization. Then at last I rose in revolt. I could endure my oppressions no longer. I pulled my fortitude together and tore off my chains, and was a free man again, and happy. From that day I burned the secretary's fat envelopes the moment they arrived, and by they ceased to come. Well, in the sociable frankness of that night in Bendigo I brought this all out in full confession. Then Mr. Blank came out in the same frank way, and with a preliminary word of gentle apology said that he was the Mark Twain Club, and the only member it had ever had. Why, it was matter for anger. But I didn't feel any. He said he never had to work for a living, and that by the time he was 30, life had become a bore and a weariness to him. He had no interests left. They had paled and perished, one by one, and left him desolate. He had begun to think of suicide. Then, all of a sudden, he thought of that happy idea of starting an imaginary club, and went straightway to work at it, with enthusiasm and love. He was charmed with it. It gave him something to do. It elaborated itself on his hands. It became 20 times more complex and formidable than was his first rude draft of it. Every new addition to his original plan which cropped up in his mind gave him a fresh interest and a new pleasure. He designed the club badge himself, and worked over it, altering and improving it, a number of days and nights, then sent to London and had it made. It was the only one that was made. It was made for me. The rest of the club went without. He invented the 32 members and their names. He invented the 5 favorite speakers and their 5 separate styles. He invented their speeches and reported them himself. He would have kept that club going until now if I hadn't deserted, he said. He said he worked like a slave over those reports. Each of them cost him from a week to a fortnight's work, and the work gave him pleasure and kept him alive and willing to be alive. It was a bitter blow to him when the club died. Finally, there wasn't any Corrigan Castle. He had invented that, too. It was wonderful, the whole thing, and altogether the most ingenious and laborious and cheerful and painstaking practical joke I have ever heard of, and I liked it. Liked to hear him tell about it, yet I have been a hater of practical jokes from as long back as I can remember. Finally he said, "Do you remember a note from Melbourne 14 or 15 years ago, telling about your lecture tour in Australia, and your death and burial in Melbourne? A note from Henry Bascom of Bascom Hall, Upper Holywell, Hants?" "Yes." "I wrote it." "My word!" "Yes, I did it. I don't know why. I just took the notion and carried it out without stopping to think. It was wrong. It could have done harm. I was always sorry about it afterward. You must forgive me. I was Mr. Bascom's guest on his yacht, on his voyage around the world. He often spoke of you, and of the pleasant times you had had together in his home, and the notion took me, there in Melbourne, and I imitated his hand, and wrote the letter." So the mystery was cleared up, after so many, many years. End of chapter 25.